Imagine going up against an empire so powerful that politicians feared it. Witnesses disappeared, businesses paid it, and entire neighborhoods lived under its shadow. An empire that didn't just break the law, it practically rewrote the rules. For decades, the American Mafia looked untouchable. It controlled unions, construction, gambling, loans, extortion, and murder with terrifying efficiency. Everybody knew its name, but almost nobody could stop it. And then, one man decided he would do what everyone else thought was impossible. He challenged the American Mafia directly, and won. This is not a movie plot. This is the real story of how one prosecutor took on the most powerful crime syndicate in America and brought its leaders crashing down. To understand how insane this was, you have to understand what New York looked like in the 1970s and 1980s. This wasn't just a city with organized crime. This was a city where organized crime had deep roots in everyday life. The Mafia wasn't hiding in dark alleys doing random crimes. It was embedded in the system. The five families, Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, were not street gangs. They were criminal corporations. Each had soldiers, captains, bosses, and networks of influence. And above them all sat something even more powerful: the Commission. Think of it like the boardroom of the American Mafia. This was where major decisions were made, disputes were settled, territories were discussed, and power was maintained. That was the genius of the system. The bosses at the top were insulated. They rarely touched the crime directly. They didn't pull the trigger. They didn't make the handoff. They didn't show up at the street level. So when police made arrests, they usually got the smaller guys, the hitmen, the collectors, the messengers. But the men giving the orders? They stayed protected behind layers of silence and fear. It was like trying to destroy a monster by cutting off one claw at a time, while the head remained perfectly safe. Then came Rudy Giuliani, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Long before he became a national political figure, Giuliani built his reputation as a prosecutor willing to go after targets that others considered too powerful, too protected, or too dangerous. But what made him different was not just courage. It was strategy. He understood that the Mafia could not be beaten by treating each crime as a separate event. That approach had failed for years. Instead, he looked at the mob as what it really was: one massive criminal enterprise. And that changed everything. Giuliani's weapon was a law called RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Now, the name sounds technical, but its power was devastating. RICO allowed prosecutors to do something revolutionary. Instead of charging mob figures for isolated crimes one by one, they could connect those crimes to a broader criminal organization and show a pattern of racketeering. In simple terms, it meant you could finally go after the bosses for running the machine, even if they weren't personally caught committing every individual act. That was the breakthrough. Because the American Mafia didn't survive on one murder or one scam. It survived on structure, on coordination, on hierarchy, on a system where everyone played a role, while the men at the top stayed clean enough to avoid conviction. Giuliani realized that if you attacked the structure itself, you could bring down the entire myth of Mafia invincibility. But knowing that, and proving it in court, were two very different things. Investigators had to build a case strong enough to hit the top. That meant surveillance, wiretaps, informants, bugs, financial evidence, and patience. A lot of patience. The FBI and prosecutors began piecing together how the commission operated, how the families communicated, how decisions were made, and how rackets were enforced. Slowly, they began to hear the mafia in its own words. Recorded conversations, hidden meetings, discussions that revealed not random criminal acts, but a coordinated system. And once those pieces came together, the government finally had something it had never truly had before: a roadmap to the top. Then came the move that shook the underworld. In 1985, Giuliani announced indictments against the leaders of New York's 5 families and other major mafia figures in what became known as the Mafia Commission Trial. This was not a normal mob case. This was the case. It was a direct strike at the ruling body of organized crime in America. Instead of going after one family, one boss, or one murder, Giuliani aimed straight at the commission itself. It was as if someone had finally walked into the control room of a criminal empire and switched on the lights. And the impact was immediate. The mafia had spent decades building an aura of fear and inevitability. People believed the bosses were beyond reach, that no matter what happened on the streets, the men at the top would survive. But now they were being dragged into court, named, exposed, and forced to answer for the entire machinery they had spent years hiding behind. Of course, the fight was far from over. The mafia didn't just fold. These were some of the most powerful and ruthless men in America. They had money, lawyers, loyalists, and long experience gaming the system. Delay tactics came into play. Pressure mounted. The atmosphere surrounding the case was intense because everyone understood what was at stake. If Giuliani lost, it would reinforce the idea that the mafia really was untouchable. But if he won, it would send a message that organized crime, no matter how sophisticated, could be dismantled. Then the verdict came. Several of the most powerful mafia leaders in America were convicted. Some were sentenced to 100 years in prison. Let that sink in. Men who had built careers on intimidation, secrecy, and absolute control were suddenly facing the full force of the justice system. The heads of the machine had finally been hit. And once that happened, the image of total mafia invincibility began to collapse. That is what made this victory so important. It wasn't just about prison sentences. It was about destroying the illusion. Because power, like the mafia's, depends on more than guns and money. It depends on belief. Belief that resistance is useless. Belief that the top can never be touched. Belief that fear will always win. Giuliani's case shattered that belief. Now, to be clear, the mafia did not vanish overnight. Organized crime didn't simply disappear the next morning. But the commission trial dealt a historic blow to the traditional power of the 5 families. It proved that the federal government could build a case not just against mob associates, but against the bosses themselves. It changed the way prosecutors approached organized crime, and it marked the beginning of the end of an era in which the American Mafia ruled from the shadows with near total confidence. What makes this story so powerful is that it wasn't won with brute force. It wasn't won in a shootout. It was won through patience, legal innovation, evidence, and the willingness to think bigger than everyone else had before. While others kept trying to arrest individual criminals, Giuliani went after the architecture of the empire. And that may be the biggest lesson of all. Sometimes the only way to defeat something powerful is to stop fighting its symptoms and start attacking its structure. Sometimes one person changes history, not because he is stronger than the enemy, but because he understands the enemy better than anyone else. The American Mafia had money, fear, silence, and decades of control on its side. But in the end, one man found the weakness in the system and pressed hard enough to make the whole thing crack. For years, the Mafia believed no one could touch the men at the top. Then one prosecutor proved them wrong. One man challenged the American Mafia and won.